The air in Trattoria Valerius was thick with the ghosts of garlic and basil, a warm, savory haze that clung to the dark wood paneling and the deep red velvet of the booths. It was late, the hour when the city's pulse slowed to a tired murmur, and the restaurant's own rhythm followed suit. The boisterous symphony of dinner service had faded to a quiet adagio of clinking cutlery and the low hum of conversations winding down. Most of the staff moved with the lethargy of a finished race, their energy spent, their movements softened by fatigue. But not her, not Ilara. She moved through the landscape of abandoned meals and stained tablecloths with an economy of motion that was almost unnatural. There was no wasted energy, no superfluous gesture. When she cleared a table, her hands swept over the plates and glasses in a single, fluid sequence. When she wiped down the polished wood, it was with long, even strokes, as if she were planing the surface rather than cleaning it. Her uniform was a simple black blouse and trousers, functional and drab, designed to render her invisible. She wore it like a second skin, a deliberate erasure of self. To the patrons, she was a shadow, a pair of hands, a function rather than a person. This was how she wanted it. Invisibility was a fortress, and she had spent years building its walls. In the corner booth, Mr. Anselmo sat alone, as he did every Tuesday and Friday. He was a man carved from gentler times, his suit jacket worn but immaculate, his white hair combed neatly over a scalp that showed the map of a long life. He was a widower, and the trattoria was his quiet harbor in a sea of silent evenings. He never stayed long, always ordered the veal saltimbocca, and always left a tip that was precisely 20%, calculated to the penny. He spoke little, but his eyes, when they met Ilara's, were kind. They held a quiet understanding, the recognition of one solitary soul for another. He was part of the restaurant's quiet rhythm, a steady, predictable note in its nightly composition. The name on the frosted glass door read Valerius, but Mr. Valerius himself was more concept than man. He was the gravity that held this small universe together, an unseen force felt in the meticulous standards of the service, the fearful respect in the manager's voice, and the rumor-laced silence that followed any mention of his name. The staff spoke of him in whispers, a figure of immense quiet power who owned this restaurant and a dozen other less savory enterprises across the city. He was a predator at rest, and his territory was peaceful only because none dared to challenge him. This peace was shattered by the chime of the bell above the door. It was a harsh, discordant sound in the hushed room, announcing an arrival that did not belong. 3 men entered, bringing the cold, sharp air of the street with them. They were a study in misplaced arrogance, their suits too shiny, their laughter too loud, their presence a violation of the room's established grace. The one in the lead was Marco Bellini, a man known in certain circles as the Viper. The name was an overstatement. A viper is silent, patient. Marco was a creature of noise and crude displays, a lieutenant whose power was borrowed, not earned. He reeked of cheap cologne trying to masquerade as expensive taste, a scent that fought with the honest aroma of the kitchen and lost. He and his men moved like sharks in a koi pond, all predatory drift and sneering confidence, their eyes scanning the room not for its beauty, but for its vulnerabilities. They chose a table directly beside Mr. Anselmo. The delicate atmosphere of the trattoria curdled. The remaining conversations faltered, then died out completely, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. The low hum of contentment was gone. supplanted by the grating sound of Marco's voice as he barked an order at the youngest waiter, a boy named Leo, whose hands had begun to tremble. The temperature of the room seemed to drop several degrees. Ilara, standing by the service station, felt it as a physical pressure, a change in the barometric reading of the space. She continued polishing a wine glass, her movements outwardly calm, but her focus was absolute. She was a seismograph, registering the tremor that ran through the room, the subtle shift in the tectonic plates of power. Marco and his crew ignored their menus. They were not here for the food. They were here for the theater of intimidation, their attention fixed on Mr. Anselmo, who was trying to make himself smaller, to shrink into the velvet of his booth. They began to talk, their voices loud enough to carry, their words dripping with a casual cruelty. They mocked his old-fashioned suit, the careful way he cut his veal, the solitude of his meal. It was the casual sadism of the playground bully, amplified by the impunity of adult power. "This is what happens when you get old," Marco said, his voice slick with false pity. "You end up alone, talking to your food." His men snickered, a chorus of hyenas backing their lion. Mr. Anselmo's face, already pale, lost another shade of color. He set down his fork and knife, his appetite gone. Ilara felt a familiar coldness bloom in her chest. It was the feeling of a locked door being tested, the rattle of a handle she had promised herself never to turn again. She had built her life on a foundation of non-involvement. She was a ghost, a witness, never a participant. To intervene was to become visible, and to become visible was to be a target. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. Her father's workshop, the scent of sawdust and drafting ink, his large, calloused hand resting on her shoulder. He was pointing at a blueprint, at the intricate web of lines that represented a skyscraper. "Remember, Ilara," he had said, his voice a low rumble, "a structure is only as strong as its foundation. Integrity isn't a design feature you add later. It is the first principle. You build on rock or you build on sand. There is no in-between." She squeezed the polishing cloth in her hand, the soft cotton a poor anchor against the tide of memory. She had chosen sand for so long, a life that could be washed away without a trace. It was safer that way. Leo, the young waiter, squared his shoulders. He was barely 20, a boy playing at being a man, his courage outstripping his common sense. He approached Marco's table. "Sir," he began, his voice cracking slightly, "is there anything I can get for you?" He was trying to de-escalate, to redirect, to do his job. Marco didn't even look at him. He waved a dismissive hand, a flick of the wrist that said, "You are an insect." The boy retreated, his face flushed with a mixture of fear and shame. He had tried to reinforce the rules of this place, the simple civility that governed it, but he had no power. He was part of the structure, but not its foundation. The foundation was cracking. The sound of shattering glass was sharp, explosive. It cut through the tension like a gunshot. Marco had accidentally knocked over Mr. Anselmo's water glass. Water and shards of glass spread across the white tablecloth, soaking into the old man's trousers. Mr. Anselmo flinched, a small bird-like movement. The attack was no longer verbal. It had become physical. "Oh, my apologies," Marco sneered, the words an insult wrapped in the guise of courtesy. "Look at the mess I've made." He then looked directly at Mr. Anselmo, his eyes cold and reptilian. "An old man like you should have quicker hands. Maybe you should clean that up, show you can still be useful." It was a calculated act of humiliation. It was designed to strip a man of his final currency. His dignity. Mr. Anselmo's hands trembled as he reached for a napkin, his face a mask of shame. He was going to do it. He was going to capitulate. In that single heartbreaking moment of surrender, something in Alara broke, or perhaps something was reset. The promise she had made to herself, to stay hidden, to survive, was weighed against the principle her father had instilled in her. You build on rock, or you build on sand. Her quiet, sandy existence suddenly felt like a tomb. She folded the polishing cloth, placing it deliberately on the counter. The action was small, but it was a verdict. It was the drawing of a line. She began to walk toward the table. The journey from the service station to the corner booth was only a dozen feet, but the narration of her mind stretched it into a mile. Each step was a conscious decision. The soft, rubber-soled shoes made almost no sound on the polished floorboards, a soundlessness that was more menacing than heavy footfalls. The other patrons watched her, their eyes wide. Leo watched her, his expression a mix of terror and hope. She was no longer a shadow. She was a solid object moving with purpose, and her movement bent the light and sound of the room around her. She was not walking toward Marco. She was walking toward a point of structural failure, a flaw in the design that threatened to bring the whole edifice down. She had spent a decade observing. The time for observation was over. Her shadow fell across the table first, a cool eclipse that momentarily blotted out the warm light of the overhead lamp. Marco looked up, annoyance twisting his features. He saw only the waitress, the servant, a minor functionary of the establishment. He was about to speak, to dismiss her with a crude remark, but she did not give him the chance. She did not look at him. Her attention was solely on the elderly man beside him. "Sir," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying a strange resonance in the silent room. "Allow me." She moved with the same dispassionate efficiency she applied to every other task. With one hand, she swept the larger shards of glass into a napkin. With the other, she retrieved a fresh cloth from her apron and began sopping up the spilled water. Her movements were clean, precise, almost surgical. There was no anger in them, no fear. There was only a profound and unsettling competence. She was a professional handling a routine problem, and her complete lack of emotional display was more unnerving than any outburst would have been. Marco watched, a smirk playing on his lips. He was amused by the interruption. He leaned back in his chair, spreading his arms in a gesture of magnanimous ownership. "See? That's what they're here for," he said to his men, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear, "to clean up our messes. When you're done with that, sweetheart, bring us a bottle of the Barolo, the expensive one." His men chuckled. They saw what he saw, a woman in her place, performing her duty. Alara finished cleaning the spill. She carefully folded the wet cloth and placed the napkin full of broken glass on her service tray. Only then did she straighten up and look at Marco Bellini. It was the first time she had made direct eye contact with him, and the shift was palpable. Her eyes were not the eyes of a waitress. They were not deferential, not fearful, not empty. They were a cool, clear gray, the color of a winter sky over the ocean. They were analytical. They held his gaze and took his measure, and in that long, silent moment he felt an unfamiliar prickle of unlicence. It was the look of a master architect examining a shoddy piece of workmanship, a gaze that saw not the surface but the flawed structure beneath. It was a look that judged him and found him wanting. A single quiet sentence dropped into the charged silence. "You are disturbing the other guests." It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, delivered in a low, even tone that held no hint of insubordination. It was the voice of authority, and it was coming from the most powerless person in the room. The sheer dissonance of it was a shock to Marco's system. He blinked, his smirk faltering. For a moment he was genuinely confused. His brain, accustomed to a world of clear hierarchies, could not process this input. A waitress did not speak to him this way. It was a violation of the natural order. Then confusion gave way to rage. The blood rushed to his face, turning his skin a mottled red. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he snarled, shoving his chair back as he rose to his feet. He was a big man, and he used his size as a weapon, looming over her, trying to physically dominate the space between them. His men shifted in their seats, their hands tensing, ready to back his play. The air crackled with the promise of violence. The restaurant held its breath. Leo looked as if he might faint. Mr. Anselmo had shrunk so far into the booth, he had almost disappeared. Elara did not flinch. She did not step back. She held her ground, a small, still point in the brewing storm. Her gaze did not waver from his face. She seemed to draw strength from the very floorboards, rooted to the spot by a force he could not comprehend. Her stillness was an act of defiance more profound than any shout. She let his rage wash over her, a wave breaking against a stone jetty. When it had crested, she moved. It was a small movement. She simply lifted her hand, not in a threatening gesture, but with a slow, deliberate grace. She pointed, not at him, but past him, toward the heavy oak doors at the front of the restaurant. Her voice, when it came, was no louder than before, but it was imbued with an absolute, unshakable finality. Out. Now. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a physical presence, a vacuum that sucked all the air and sound from the room. It pressed in on the eardrums, heavy and absolute. For 2 full seconds no one moved, no one breathed. The command hung in the air, audacious and unbelievable. Marco stood frozen, his face a mask of incredulous fury. The entire narrative of his life, a story built on fear and intimidation, had just been contradicted by a waitress in a cheap uniform. The world had tilted on its axis. He had been given an order. He, Marco the Viper Bellini, had been told what to do. The absurdity of it was so total that it short-circuited his rage, leaving only a cold, simmering disbelief. Then the circuit reconnected. A harsh, ugly laugh tore from his throat. It was the sound of a predator reasserting its dominance. "You're dead," he whispered. The words, a promise. He reached for her. His hand, thick-fingered and heavy with a gaudy ring, shot out to grab the front of her blouse. It was a movement meant to be overwhelming, to pull her off balance and drag her into his world of brute force. But it never landed. Her own hand moved with a speed that seemed to defy physics. It was not a block or a strike. It was an interception. Her fingers, deft and sure, closed around his wrist, mid-motion. It was the movement of a watchmaker, not a brawler. She did not grab his wrist. She acquired it. The contact was light, almost delicate, but the effect was immediate and devastating. Her thumb found the precise point between 2 bones, a place where a bundle of nerves lay close to the surface. She applied pressure. It was not a crude squeeze of strength, but an intelligent, focused application of leverage and anatomical knowledge. It was the cold, efficient science of pain. The narration of the scene shifted, the slow-motion observation giving way to a staccato rhythm of cause and effect. His hand moved, hers intercepted. His momentum continued, her grip held firm. The force of his own lunge was turned against him. Marco's face cycled through a series of emotions with comical speed. Arrogance gave way to surprise, surprise to confusion, and confusion to a sudden, blinding agony that made his vision swim. It was a clean, sharp, electric pain, completely alien to the dull trauma of a fist fight. He tried to pull his arm back, but her grip, though it looked effortless, was like a clamp of forged steel. He was connected to her and through her to the unyielding floor. He was a collapsing structure, and she was the unshakable foundation he had crashed against. A memory, sharp as a shard of the broken glass, flashed through her mind. She was 17, standing with her father in the skeletal frame of a new bridge. The wind whipped her hair across her face. Her father was pointing to a massive steel joint, a nexus of load-bearing girders. "Everything has a stress point, Elara," he had shouted over the wind. "The point where the most force is concentrated. It can be a structure's greatest strength or its most catastrophic weakness. The secret is knowing where to apply pressure." She felt the pulse in Marco's wrist, a frantic, terrified bird beating against the cage of her fingers. She knew exactly where to apply pressure. The sound of a bone groaning under torsion was sickeningly audible in the silent room. Marco's legs buckled. A strangled gasp escaped his lips as she increased the pressure, twisting his wrist at an angle that nature had never intended. He was forced to his knees, his face now level with her waist. The big man, the predator, was kneeling before his prey. His two thugs, who had half risen from their chairs, were frozen in place. This was not in their script. They were enforcers used to the predictable ballet of intimidation and casual violence. What they were witnessing was something else entirely. It was a dismantling. They saw their leader, the source of their borrowed power, being taken apart with the calm precision of a bomb disposal expert. Their bravado evaporated, replaced by a primal instinctive fear of the unknown. They were street dogs who had just tried to bite a wolf. Elara leaned down slightly, her face close to his ear. Her voice was a whisper, a thread of sound that was for him alone, yet it seemed to fill the entire room. "I will not say it again." She held the pressure for one more heartbeat, searing the lesson of her dominance into his nervous system. Then, just as suddenly as she had grabbed him, she let go. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees like a crab, clutching his injured wrist to his chest. His face was slick with sweat, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and pure, undiluted humiliation. He stumbled to his feet, his balance unsteady. He looked at his men, a desperate, pleading look for support, for someone to affirm that what just happened had not really happened. But he found no help in their faces. He saw only his own fear reflected back at him. The power dynamic of their small pack had been irrevocably shattered. He was no longer the alpha. He shot one last look at Elara, a look of pure, venomous hatred that was undercut by the terror in his eyes. Then he turned and all but fled, shoving his way past the tables and bursting through the oak doors into the night. His men, after a moment of stunned hesitation, followed him, a disorderly and shameful retreat into the shadows from which they had emerged. The heavy oak door swung shut, its solid thud echoing in the profound silence left in the wake of the storm. For a long moment, the entire restaurant was a tableau vivant, every patron and staff member frozen in place, their minds struggling to process the scene they had just witnessed. The air, once thick with menace, was now thin and sharp, vibrating with the aftershock of the confrontation. Then slowly, a single sound broke the stillness, the quiet, shaky exhale of Leo, the young waiter. Ilara's composure remained absolute. The storm had passed through her, but she was untouched by it, an eye of calm. The coldness in her chest receded, replaced by the familiar gray stillness she had cultivated for years. She turned away from the door, her attention shifting back to the man she had chosen to protect. Mr. Anselmo was staring at her, his expression one of utter astonishment, mingled with a dawning, profound gratitude. His fear was gone, replaced by an awe that bordered on reverence. Ilara offered him a small, almost imperceptible nod. She then extended her hand. It was not the hand of a warrior, but the hand of a caregiver. "Sir, let me help you to another table. We will bring you a fresh meal." Her voice was steady, gentle, the same quiet tone she always used. It was an act of simple human decency, a gesture that sought to repair the civility that had been so brutally torn. Mr. Anselmo took her hand, his own still trembling slightly, and allowed her to help him to his feet. In a small, dark room tucked away in the basement of the building, the entire drama had played out on a bank of flickering monitors. Sal, the night security guard, sat hunched forward in his worn chair, his eyes glued to the screen showing Camera 4, the one covering the main dining room. He was a man in his late 60s, a former cop who had seen his share of violence, both petty and profound. He had watched Marco Bellini and his crew enter, and a familiar, weary resignation had settled over him. He knew who Marco was, and he knew that his job was to observe, to record, but never to intervene in the affairs of Mr. Valerius's chosen people. But what he had just seen had shaken him from his professional torpor. He leaned forward and tapped a button, rewinding the footage. He watched it again, this time ignoring the sound, focusing only on the visuals. He watched Ilara's walk from the service station, the unnerving stillness with which she faced Marco, and then the critical 5 seconds of physical contact. He slowed the footage down, frame by frame. He saw it clearly now, the way she intercepted Marco's wrist, the placement of her thumb, the subtle shift in her body weight as she used his own momentum to break his posture. It was not a bar fight. It was not a lucky move. It was a system. It was disciplined, ruthlessly efficient, and utterly devoid of wasted motion. It was the work of someone who had been trained, and trained well. Sal had seen cops and soldiers move like that, but he had never seen it from a waitress who spent her nights clearing tables. He picked up the secure telephone on his desk, the one that bypassed the main switchboard. It rang twice before it was answered with a quiet, expectant silence. Sal cleared his throat. "Sir," he said, his voice raspy. "It's Sal. You need to see the footage from the dining room. Right now." The scent of old leather, fine tobacco, and power hung in the air of Mr. Valerius's office. It was not a room designed to impress, but to command. The walls were lined with dark mahogany bookshelves, filled not with decorative volumes, but with well-worn tomes on history, philosophy, and engineering. A single moody Caravaggio hung on the wall, its deep shadows and stark light echoing the room's atmosphere. Behind a desk the size of a small boat sat the man himself, Niccolo Valerius. He was a figure of immense stillness, a predator at rest. His 60 years were etched into his face, not as weakness, but as a testament to survival. He sat perfectly upright in his chair, watching the security footage on a large monitor built into his desk. Sal stood silently in the corner of the room, barely daring to breathe. Valerius watched the entire sequence 3 times without a word. His face was a granite mask, betraying no emotion. He watched Ilara's walk. He watched her stand her ground. He watched the precise, brutal efficiency of her technique. He saw what Sal had seen, but his understanding went deeper. He saw not just skill, but character. He saw restraint held until the last possible second. He saw courage that was not reckless, but deliberate. He saw a woman who chose to act not for herself, but for a helpless old man. He finally switched off the monitor, the screen going black. The silence in the room deepened. He turned his head slowly and looked at Sal. His voice, when he finally spoke, was like the grinding of old stones, deep and resonant with authority. "Find out who she is," he commanded. He paused, his dark eyes fixed on Sal. "Not what she is, who she is." Alara finished her shift in a state of calm resignation. She expected to be fired. She expected a visit from the police, or worse, a visit from Marco's more competent associates. The fortress of her invisibility had been breached, not by an enemy, but by her own hand. There was a strange peace in it. The constant, draining effort of self-erasure was over. She went about her closing duties with the same methodical care as always, wiping down the last tables, restocking the salt shakers, polishing the silverware. When the manager, a perpetually nervous man named Julian, approached her, his face pale, she was ready. "Mr. Valerius wants to see you," he stammered, avoiding her eyes. "Now." Alara simply nodded. "Of course he does." She untied her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. The life she had tried to bury was finally digging its way out. The walk to Mr. Valerius's office was a journey through the hidden anatomy of the restaurant. Julian led her away from the public spaces, through the swinging doors of the kitchen, past the heat and clang of the cleanup crew, and into the cool, silent service corridors that were the building's arteries. The sounds of the restaurant faded, replaced by the low hum of ventilation systems and the echo of their own footsteps on the concrete floor. They rode a small private elevator, its interior lined with polished brass, ascending in silence. A single large man in a tailored suit stood guard outside a heavy oak door. He was built like a bank vault, and his eyes were as cold and hard as polished steel. He nodded once at Julian, who scurried away like a frightened mouse, leaving Alara alone with the guard. The guard opened the door for her without a word. She stepped inside. The room was just as she had imagined it, a sanctuary of quiet, masculine power. Valerius sat behind his desk, as still as the portraits on the wall. He looked up as she entered, his eyes dark and assessing. He did not rise. He simply gestured to the leather chair opposite him. "Sit." The word was a command, not an invitation. She sat her back straight, her hands resting calmly in her lap. The air was thick with unspoken questions, a dense medium through which only truth could travel. He did not speak for a full minute, simply observing her, letting the weight of his silence press down. He was testing her, looking for the cracks, the tells of fear or deception. He found none. She met his gaze with a calm neutrality that seemed to unnerve him more than any defiance could. Finally, he pushed a thin file across the vast expanse of the polished desk. It slid to a stop directly in front of her. Her name was on the tab, but it was not the name she had used for the last 8 years. It was her real name, Alara Rostova. She opened it. Inside were copies of newspaper clippings, legal documents, a photograph of her father, and a grainy photo of herself from a university ID card. She saw the story of her own destruction laid out in black and white. Anton Rostova, the brilliant structural engineer, the architect of vision and integrity. The headlines screamed of his disgrace: bridge project scandal, corruption probe, structural flaws revealed. It was all there. The lies, the fabricated evidence, the public shaming orchestrated by his chief rival, a ruthless developer named Silas Thorne. Thorne had built his empire on cutting corners and destroying competitors, and her father had been his masterpiece of destruction. The final document was a brief clinical coroner's report detailing her father's suicide. She closed the file, her movements slow and deliberate. She felt a deep, familiar ache, the ghost limb of her former life. She looked up at Valerius. He had not moved. "I knew your father," he said, his voice softer now, stripped of its hard, commanding edge. "Not well, but I knew his work. He was an artist. He built things to last, a flicker of something that might have been respect, or perhaps even sorrow, passed through his dark eyes. I also know Silas Thorne. He is a man who builds on sand, a cancer in this city." Valerius leaned forward slightly, his gaze intensifying. "He ruined your father with lies about a structure's integrity. He created a phantom weakness to destroy a real strength." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I did not know Anton had a daughter. It seems he taught you well." Alara waited for the threat, for the offer of a job as an enforcer, a piece of muscle for his organization. It was the logical next step. He had seen her skill, but Valerius surprised her. He gestured to a set of rolled-up blueprints on the corner of his desk. "Thorne is building a new luxury condominium tower, the Elysian. He won the bid through his usual methods, bribes, threats, but he is over-leveraged. He is cutting corners. I know it. I can feel it, but I cannot prove it. The city inspectors are in his pocket. He is building another lie, and this time people will live inside it." Valerius looked directly at her, his eyes boring into hers. "I don't need a bodyguard, Ms. Rostova. I have plenty of those. I need an architect. I need someone who knows how to read the story a building tells. I need you to find the flaw in his design." The sensation of the heavy, crisp paper of a blueprint beneath her fingertips was a ghost returning to inhabit her body. It had been 8 years since she had touched the language of her father, the language of structure and form. She stood in the center of a vast, echoing construction site, the skeleton of the Elysian Tower rising around her into the gray morning sky. The air smelled of wet concrete, raw steel, and diesel fumes. It was the perfume of her childhood, a scent that unlocked 1,000 memories of trailing her father through his own monumental creations. She was no longer in the drab black uniform of a waitress. Valerius had provided her with a simple, well-cut gray pantsuit, a new uniform for a new, or rather reclaimed life. For 2 days, she lived in the construction trailer Valerius's men had secured for her on a property overlooking the site. The trailer was filled with copies of every document related to the Elysian project: blueprints, materials, manifests, engineering reports, soil sample analyses, daily work logs. It was a mountain of data, a complex structure of information designed to conceal as much as it revealed. To anyone else, it would be an impenetrable fortress of technical jargon. To her, it was a language she knew better than her own name. She began to read. She worked with a feverish monastic focus. She ate little, slept less. She cross-referenced the steel specifications on the architectural drawings with the shipping manifests from the supplier. She compared the concrete composition reports with the daily pour logs. She ran the load-bearing calculations for the central support columns herself, using her father's old slide rule, a talisman she had kept with her through all her years of exile. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. It was a portrait of a crime painted in numbers and engineering symbols. The discrepancies were small at first, almost unnoticeable. A slightly lower grade of rebar than specified, a concrete mix that used a cheaper, less stable aggregate. But as she dug deeper, she saw the pattern. The compromises were not random. They were systematic. They were concentrated in the core of the building, the load-bearing columns and foundational slabs that would be hidden from view once the structure was complete. Silas Thorne was not just cutting corners, he was gutting the building from the inside out. He was creating a structure that would pass the superficial inspections of his paid-off officials, a glittering facade built around a rotten core. It was designed to stand just long enough for him to sell the units, collect his profits, and disappear. The timeline in the report suggested a potential for catastrophic failure within 15 to 20 years. It was the exact same accusation, the same lie, that Thorne had used to frame her father. The irony was so bitter it tasted like rust. On the third day she found it, the keystone of the entire fraud, a single falsified engineering report signed off by a reputable firm that Thorne secretly controlled through a shell corporation. The report certified the integrity of the foundational steel, using data that she could now prove was physically impossible given the materials listed on the shipping manifests. It was the load-bearing lie that held the entire corrupt enterprise together. It was the stress point. She sat back in her chair, the single sheet of paper in her hand. The hum of the trailer's generator seemed to fade into the background. She felt not anger, not the heat of revenge, but a cold, clear certainty. She picked up the secure phone Valerius had given her. "I found it," she said, her voice steady. "It's worse than you thought, but it's beautiful. He built his fortress out of paper, and I've found the page that will tear it all down." The boardroom was a glass box suspended 50 stories above the city. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like a galaxy of tiny stars. Silas Thorne sat at the head of a long, polished obsidian table, a smug, self-satisfied smile on his face. He was surrounded by his lawyers, a phalanx of expensive suits and predatory smiles. Across the table sat Mr. Valerius, flanked by his own legal team. Ilara sat beside Valerius, a slim portfolio resting in front of her. She was invisible again, but this time it was a strategic invisibility. To Thorne and his team, she was just an anonymous aide, a secretary, a nobody. Thorne was posturing, confident. He believed this was a shakedown, a typical power play from a rival. Valerius wanted a piece of the Elysian project, and Thorne was prepared to negotiate, to cede a small slice of his corrupt pie to keep the peace. He had no idea he was walking into an execution. Valerius let him talk for 10 minutes, a long, rambling monologue about progress and partnership and the bright future of the city. Valerius listened with his customary stillness, his face impassive. When Thorne had finally exhausted his supply of platitudes, Valerius turned his head slightly and nodded at Ilara. She opened her portfolio. She did not speak. She simply began to place documents on the table, one by one. The shipping manifest for the substandard steel, the chemical analysis of the fraudulent concrete mix, the independent geological survey that contradicted Thorne's soil stability reports. With each new document, the smugness on Thorne's face tightened, the smile becoming a grimace. His lawyers began to shift uncomfortably, whispering to each other, their predatory confidence draining away. The final document she placed on the table was the falsified engineering report. Beside it, she placed her own analysis, a devastating line-by-line deconstruction that proved its claims were a mathematical and physical impossibility. "It's a forgery," Thorne blustered, his voice suddenly shrill. "Slander. My project is sound." Elara looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time. She saw a man made of cheap materials, a hollow structure with a glittering facade. "You know," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the cold weight of absolute certainty, "the fascinating thing about structural engineering is that it has no capacity for lies. Steel can either bear a load or it cannot. Concrete either has integrity or it crumbles. Numbers do not have opinions. Your building is a monument to a lie, Mr. Thorne, and like all poorly constructed things, it is about to collapse." The aftermath was not a single explosive event, but a controlled demolition. Valerius's legal team released Elara's report to the district attorney's office and a single trusted journalist. The story broke the next morning. The headlines were a mirror image of the ones that had destroyed her father. Elysian Tower, a death trap, developer accused of massive fraud, city officials implicated. Thorne's empire, built on a foundation of lies and intimidation, crumbled in a matter of days. His investors fled, his political allies abandoned him, and he was soon buried under an avalanche of lawsuits and criminal indictments. The last Elara saw of him was a photograph on a news website, a pale, shrunken man in handcuffs being led from his glass office, his face a mask of disbelief. He had been ruined not by a gun or a fist, but by the immutable laws of physics. The weapon he had forged to destroy her father had become the instrument of his own downfall. Weeks later, Elara stood with Niccolo Valerius on the balcony of his penthouse apartment. The city spread out below them, a glittering carpet of light under a velvet night sky. The air was cool and clean, carrying the distant sound of sirens and the ceaseless hum of urban life. The skeletal frame of the Elysian Tower, now a monument to a dead man's hubris, was a dark silhouette against the horizon. Valerius had acquired the site and all its assets in the bankruptcy auction for pennies on the dollar. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice cubes clinking softly. He turned to her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "The city has issued a demolition order. They will tear it down next month." He paused, then gestured with his glass toward the failed structure. "I am putting together a new proposal, a new design, a building worthy of this city, a building with integrity." He looked at her, his dark eyes holding a question. "I need an architect to lead the project. Your father's name was Rostova. It meant to grow. It is time to build something again." He was not offering her a job. He was offering her a restoration. She looked out at the city, at the endless grid of streets and structures, a complex system of stress and support. For years she had seen it as a place to hide, a wilderness of concrete and steel in which to lose herself. Now she saw it differently. She saw the lines of force, the load-bearing walls, the foundations upon which everything rested. She looked down at her own hands. They were no longer the hands of a waitress, calloused from harsh cleaning chemicals and the endless clearing of other people's messes. They felt different. They felt like her father's hands, capable, creative, strong. She did not need to avenge her father. Vengeance was a form of demolition, an act of tearing down. Her father had been a builder. She would honor his legacy not by destroying his enemy, but by completing his work. She turned to Valerius and gave him a single decisive nod. The self-erasure was over. She had found her true name again, not by looking to the past, but by designing the future. He had offered her a chance to settle a debt of blood and ruin. She chose instead to lay a new foundation. For true strength is not the power to tear things down, but the discipline to build them correctly from the ground up.